I first became interested in the dark web during my second year of university. I was taking a module on cybersecurity when the subject came up during a seminar, and it seemed like this mysterious, almost mythical corner of the internet that few people truly understood. I read articles and watched videos about it, some sensationalized, others more technical, and I was fascinated by the idea of this vast hidden network lying just beneath the surface. I won't lie, I was curious regarding the darker side of things, but it wasn't where my interests were rooted. I wanted to understand the technology, the architecture, as well as what purpose it might have in the online landscape of tomorrow. Accessing it turned out to be easier than I'd imagined. I downloaded the Tor browser, which is designed to anonymize your online activity by routing traffic through a series of volunteer-operated servers, and then to be extra cautious, I used a VPN for another layer of security. Navigating the dark web wasn't like using Google, where everything is indexed and easy to find. Instead, you have to use directories like the Hidden Wiki to locate onion sites. And to learn how to do that, I joined forums to learn the ropes from people who had been exploring the dark web for years. And then once I was ready, I began exploring. At first, my discoveries were at best surprisingly harmless and sometimes wholesome, and at worst, only mildly unsettling. I found a lot of resources dedicated to online privacy, such as guides on using encrypted messaging apps or secure email platforms, and advice on avoiding surveillance. These weren't tools for criminals either. A big portion of the market seemed to be people like journalists and activists in countries with oppressive governments, which was a very cool aspect that hadn't even occurred to me until that point. But then a lot of users seemed to just be regular people who appeared to greatly value their digital privacy. But while some people simply trying to get ahead in a changing world of online activity, others exhibited decidedly unhealthy tendencies. For example, there was a small contingent of users who believed that they were the victims of what's called gang stalking. Gang stalking refers to the belief that a person is being systematically harassed by a coordinated group. They often describe constant surveillance, sabotage, social isolation, and public intimidation orchestrated by strangers, acquaintances, or even authorities like the federal government. It's true that a handful of isolated cases of organized harassment have been recorded, but what's important to keep in mind is that most reports of gang stalking lack any kind of evidence whatsoever and can often be caused by things like paranoia, anxiety, and other serious psychiatric conditions. The level of paranoia sufferers experience causes them to misinterpret ordinary events as deliberate threats, which can sometimes have devastating results for their friends and families. And some of what I saw unfolding on the gang stalking forum was as disheartening as it was disturbing. People's entire lives had fallen to pieces, but instead of accepting help from family or friends, they turned inward, formed secretive online communities, and actively encouraged each other's delusions. And sometimes it appeared to have deadly consequences. For me, exploring the dark web started as an academic curiosity, but quickly became something deeper. It made me think more critically about privacy, surveillance, and how technology shapes our freedoms. The dark web didn't seem inherently good or bad. It was just a tool, and what seemed to matter most was the intent of those who used it. But as I spent more time exploring, I inevitably began to come across things that hinted at its darker side. It was gradual, almost like peeling back layers of something you're not entirely sure you want to see. There were mentions of marketplaces where illegal goods were traded, forums where people discussed activities that were clearly unethical or overtly criminal. And these weren't things that I actively sought out. They were just there, scattered amidst the harmless content. But it was the rumors of so-called red rooms that marked my first tentative steps into the deep web's darkest recesses. These were said to be live-streamed events where unspeakable acts were performed on camera for an audience willing to pay in cryptocurrency. Some claimed that they were the stuff of urban legend, exaggerated or entirely fabricated to add to the dark web's infamy. Others spoke about them with eerie detail, describing how you'd need to find hidden links and pay a steep price for access. Even though I hadn't yet seen anything that confirmed their existence, The very idea was chilling. But what really struck me about the darker corners of the deep web were how casually some people discuss such topics. In certain forums, people discussed things that were morally repugnant as if they were just innocent curiosities. It felt like stepping into a world where societal norms had been stripped away and anonymity had created a space where anything, no matter how horrifying, could flourish. Despite the darkness, I kept reminding myself why I was there in the first place, to understand, not to engage. I was careful to avoid clicking on anything suspicious or venturing too far into places I didn't belong. Still, it was impossible not to feel the weight of what the dark web could be. For every encrypted email service or activist forum, there seemed to be an equally sinister counterpart lurking in the shadows. The rumors of so-called red rooms lingered in the back of my mind as I continued exploring. They were whispered about in forums and chat rooms, yet always elusive and always unconfirmed. And at first I too dismissed them as nothing but digital urban legends, nothing but the product of overactive imaginations. But the more I read, the more I started to realize they weren't entirely the stuff of myth. It felt like an unsettling puzzle, one I wasn't sure I wanted to solve, but I couldn't resist trying to uncover the truth. My search began with forums where users claimed to have insider knowledge. The posts were cryptic, filled with vague hints and coded language. Some people described red rooms as pay-to-view live stream services where horrific acts were performed on camera, often at the request of an audience. Others dismissed the idea as impossible, pointing out the technical difficulties of streaming live video anonymously through Tor. However, there were enough detailed accounts to keep me intrigued, enough to make me wonder if some twisted corner of the internet had found a way to make it real. I followed the leads cautiously, moving through layers of forums, chat rooms, and directories, but the deeper I went, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. Places felt heavier, darker even, and I came across sites with names that felt like warnings, their plain black and white pages filled with ominous links. Some required passwords or cryptocurrency to proceed, and I hesitated. I didn't want to cross a line that I couldn't uncross, but part of me was driven by a need to know. Were these simply dead ends, or were they actually the real McCoy? And the most unnerving moments came when I found threads where people claimed to have attended those supposed events. They spoke about encrypted invitations, exorbitant Bitcoin payments, and fleeting access to streams hosted on obscure servers. It was all so surreal, yet the way they described it felt disturbingly plausible. I never found anything definitive, no actual links, no concrete evidence, but the process alone was chilling. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that even the search itself carried risks, not just of stumbling upon something horrific, but of crossing a boundary that I wasn't willing to cross. Whether or not red rooms actually exist almost seemed irrelevant toward the end, because the pursuit alone had revealed an incredibly unsettling truth about what people are capable of imagining. I logged off, shaken by the experience, but also strangely relieved that I hadn't found what I was looking for. The rumors remained just that, rumors. But the darkness I glimpsed along the way felt all too real. And in the end, it was that feeling of being so close to finding something that dragged me back down that rabbit hole. I still remember the moment I found it. It was the culmination of weeks of following cryptic threads, chasing rumors, and piecing together fragments of a puzzle that I wasn't even sure I wanted to solve. It came unexpectedly, after hours of trawling through hidden forums and dead links. A new thread had appeared in one of the darker corners of a forum posted by someone who claimed to have access to a real red room. And the post was sparse, just a brief description, a heavily encrypted link, and a demand for payment in Bitcoin. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to close the browser and walk away, but I couldn't. The curiosity that had driven me this far refused to let me quit. I transferred the required Bitcoin, an amount that made my chest tighten as I watched it leave my wallet and follow the instructions. The link took me to a blank page with a countdown timer. It felt surreal, like stepping into the setup of some macabre horror film. I waited, my heart rate beginning to quicken as I questioned every decision which led me to that moment. When the countdown hit 0, the screen flickered, and a grainy video feed appeared. The room was very stark and clinical, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast sharp shadows on the walls. A man in a lab coat stood in the center, surrounded by equipment that looked cobbled together, medical monitors, steel tables, and tools whose purposes I didn't want to imagine. The camera panned slowly, revealing a figure strapped to one of the tables. They were conscious, but their face was contorted with fear and their muffled cries were audible even through their gag and the poor audio quality. The chat panel beside the video feed erupted with activity. Anonymous viewers typed messages, some urging the host to proceed, others asking for specific acts or experiments. It was horrifying, not just because of what I was seeing, but because of the casualness of the audience. They treated it like a spectacle, something to be ordered and consumed, as if the person on the table wasn't even a human being to begin with. I don't know if they believed it was fake or something, and that's why they were able to talk that way, but to me, it looked very real. The experiments began, and I could barely stomach it. The host used injections, electrical currents, and other devices that seemed designed to test pain thresholds or biological responses. The victim writhed and screamed, their agony evident through the screen. The audience cheered, their requests growing more depraved with every passing moment, and it was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. Pure, unfiltered cruelty masquerading as scientific inquiry. I don't know how long I watched before I forced myself to close the browser and slam closed my laptop. I sat there in silence, feeling sick. My hands trembled, and I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for even having gone that far. The reality of what I'd seen was far worse than any rumor or legend. It wasn't just a myth. This was real, and it was happening somewhere, hidden in the depths of this shadowy network. That night I deleted everything. The Tor browser, my Bitcoin wallet, the logs I kept of my search. I wanted no trace of what I'd done, no connection to the sickening, skin-crawling world that I had taken a glimpse into. But those images stayed with me. They're things I'll never fully forget, as long as I live, and I suppose that's something that I have to deal with, alone.
I work as a bartender at a bar and restaurant in a suburb just outside Baltimore. I'll do my best to explain the layout so the story makes sense. It's a busy place with a unique setup. There are no waiters, just bartenders like me and the cooks in the back. If you want to find food or non-alcoholic drinks, you have to order them at the bar, and when everything's ready, you grab it from the counter. I'm not sure why things are done that way, but I guess it had something to do with management being cheap and trying to avoid hiring waiters. Either way, it keeps things fast-paced, which I actually like. For whatever reason, the place is really popular, even though I personally don't think it's anything super special. The atmosphere is lively most nights, with great music, a buzzing crowd, and a standing area near the DJ booth where people gather to dance and chat. The constant flow of customers and the high-energy vibe make the job fly by. I love meeting and talking to new people, so the gig is perfect for me. I would probably lose my mind if I had to wait long periods of time between serving guests, but that's just me. I bet some people are the opposite. That particular night started off like any other. It was a weekend, so things were going to be super busy. I was ready. After a certain time, the bar started filling up with people. It looked like more of a younger college crowd that night, which meant more dancing, more spilling, and a rowdier environment in general. Oh yeah, and worse tips, which kind of sucked for me. This one group of kids just kept on ordering round after round of tequila shots faster than I could line up the salt and limes. It's always chaos when they take over the bar. One of them was so plastered he used the same pickup line on me like 3 times. I was running around doing my thing when I noticed an elderly couple walk in and sit down at the booth in the corner of the restaurant. At first glance, there was nothing strange about them. I just thought it was interesting that 2 people that age would want to come into a rowdy place like this. I didn't have too much time to think about it though, so I went back to work. Fast forward maybe 30 minutes to an hour. I was halfway through pouring a line of gin and tonics when I noticed the couple again. My hands kept working, muscle memory taking over, but my brain was stuck on them for some reason. That's when it hit me. They were just sitting there motionlessly. They hadn't ordered anything either. No food and definitely not any drinks, I would have remembered. I looked a little closer and realized that they weren't even looking at each other. They were both fixated at the wall next to them. From what I could tell, it didn't look like they were talking either. It was the strangest thing. I was beyond curious, but the bar was slammed, and I had too much to do to spend time wondering about it. I figured they might be waiting for someone or didn't realize how the place worked. Maybe they were waiting for a waiter to take their order. When I finally had a break, I decided to check on them myself. I walked over to the table and put on my most polite smile. As I approached, neither of them turned to face me. They were both still staring at the wall like statues. I cleared my throat and asked them if they wanted anything to eat or drink. The woman didn't even flinch. She kept staring at the wall like I hadn't spoken at all. The man turned his head slowly, like he was moving in slow motion. When his face came into view, I felt a chill run through me. His skin was pale and wrinkled, and his eyes were almost sunken into his face completely. He didn't speak, just stared at me and shook his head once, firmly but silently. Something about the way he looked at me made my stomach twist. I muttered something in response and quickly returned to the bar. I had the weirdest feeling in my gut after that. Those people looked like they didn't even belong in this century, let alone this bar. I didn't look over at that booth for a long time. Eventually, things started to die down a little, and I remembered the couple. I glanced over impulsively, and I nearly dropped the glass I was holding. Both of them were staring directly at me now. I made direct eye contact with the woman, but she never averted her gaze. I don't think I'd ever been more uncomfortable at my job than I was in that moment. I looked away and pretended to be busy, trying not to freak out completely. By the time I glanced back again, the booth was empty. I was relieved. I was just glad that they were gone, as mean as that sounds. By the end of the night, I was still thinking about the whole thing. As I wiped down the bar and closed up with my coworker Karen, I decided to ask her if she saw anything strange. She's, I guess, what you would call a vet. She's been working there for years and prides herself on noticing everything and everyone that comes through the doors. When I asked her about the couple, she gave me a confused look and said she didn't know what I was talking about. I looked at her blankly and told her I was talking about the elderly couple that was sitting in the corner booth. She shook her head and told me she didn't remember seeing anyone like that. She then jokingly asked me if I was hallucinating, which got a playful laugh out of me, but on the inside though, I was losing it. I knew what I had seen. I asked her if she was sure, and she crossed her arms before listing at least 10 random people who had ordered food that night and what they were wearing. I laughed again and complimented her memory, but like I said before, I was dying on the inside. By the time we locked up, I started doubting myself. As I walked to my car, I noticed something that made me nearly drop my keys in fear. Across the street, there were 2 dark figures standing under a lone streetlight. I knew it was them. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. I didn't wait another second. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped out of the lot without another look. The drive home was awful. I was trying not to break down the whole time. I just kept repeating, "Oh my God," over and over. I had so many questions. Had Karen somehow missed them? Were those people even real? Was I going insane? I couldn't explain it. I thought I was going crazy. I wish this story had a resolved ending, but it doesn't. I never saw those people again. I never got any kind of explanation. I don't think I ever will.
Welcome back, Swamp Folk. Hope everyone's doing okay today, and hopefully everyone's feeling well and is ready for another strange mystery. Does anyone else feel like it's been too long since we've had a good old-fashioned alien story on the channel? It took quite a while to find a story that I thought would be great, and it just so happens that right as I put this out, there is a new documentary about this coming out as well, so coincidence is on our side. Here I am yet again, hat in hand, ready to show you something very interesting. CBC News dubbed this as Canada's most documented UFO case. I know aliens are usually lumped in with either science fiction, horror, or government conspiracy theories, but they really are a category unto themselves. I'm not trying to say they are definitely UFOs out there circling the planet or anything. I'm just trying to say that statistically speaking, it's not that crazy to think that there might be other life forms out there somewhere. Sure, our solar system only has 8 planets, or 9 if you refuse to let go of Pluto, but we're only one of thousands of solar systems within the Milky Way galaxy. There are an estimated 100 billion planets in our galaxy alone, and based on mapping and simulations, scientists theorize that 1 in 5 stars like our Sun should have an Earth-like planet in its orbit. That comes to 40 billion total. But don't forget, that's only our galaxy and our understanding of our galaxy. That doesn't include the hundreds of billions of other galaxies out there. So yeah, now I have my own controversial theories on everything. I don't know if I necessarily believe that Earth is so special, that aliens are here and just here, but maybe they are in contact with us, maybe not. I don't know, it's really hard to say. Is life a simulation? Is the sky actually blue? Is the grass actually green? I don't know, you tell me. Normally, when someone claims to see a UFO, they're treated as a fraud or a lunatic. To an extent, that's also true of today's case, but this one is far from typical. Whether it was a genuine UFO experience, a government experiment, or a straight-up hoax is for you to decide, but first, let me tell you just a little bit about Falcon Lake. It's a beautiful area located in Manitoba's White Shell Provincial Park on the Trans-Canada Highway near the Ontario border. It's a very popular getaway for locals and tourists alike. Park has campgrounds, cottages, picnic areas, all that good stuff. Now, it didn't quite have the same level of amenities in the 1960s that it does now, but it was still a hotspot for nature lovers. Some people even staked claims in the area to prospect for precious metals. That's what brought Stephen McCalloch to Falcon Lake on May 20th, 1967. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of this story, I have to take a moment to thank today's sponsor that allows me to be able to do these types of videos for you. After World War II, Stephen McCalloch and his wife moved from Poland to Canada, where Stephen found work as an industrial mechanic, and he also fancied himself as an amateur geologist. He regularly traveled to Falcon Lake in search of quartz and silver, knowing the quartz veins in that area often yielded gold and nickel. It was while he inspected one of these veins that he suddenly heard a flock of agitated geese. When he looked up, he saw 2 objects with reddish glows hovering roughly 150 feet away. His quoted description of the crafts were
cigarette-shaped things with humps in the middle.
At first, he believed them to be experimental American aircraft, but then one of the objects landed on a nearby rocky platform and shifted into a disc shape, while the other hovered nearby for several minutes before flying away. The landed craft remained in front of Stephen for roughly 30 minutes, and during that period, he was able to draw a sketch. Its dimensions were approximately 34 feet long by 15 feet tall, and its color alternated between gray and red. The surface resembled hot stainless steel and emanated a warm golden glow that smelled of sulfur. There were also sounds of a whirring motor and the hissing noise of air being expelled. Once finished with the sketch, Stephen dared to venture closer in search of an insignia, but he saw none. He did note that the smooth, metallic surface lacked any seams, but after a few moments of standing there, a door lined with bright light slowly opened. He heard 2 distinct but muffled voices coming from the inside, and he believed they sounded human, one voice being notably higher than the other. Assuming that the Americans were experiencing some sort of mechanical malfunction, McCalloch called, "Come on out, Yankee boys," and offered his assistance. This instantly silenced the other voices, and when there was no response, Steven merely tried speaking in Polish, then Russian, and finally German. Man, you gotta love this guy. He thought a secret government aircraft landed right in front of him. So what does he do? First he sketches it, and then he decides, oh, let's see if we can actually help these fellas out. That's brave, or maybe stupid. It depends on how you look at it. When you think it belongs to the US or Canada, that's iffy. But I see how some might feel at ease, but this guy, he was even willing to bet on the Russians in the 1960s. I want whatever he was on, that's all I'm saying. Anyway, he didn't let a lack of response get him down. No, sir. He put on his welding gloves and goggles and walked inside. Then he saw light beams and panels flashing in different colors. The craft itself seemed empty, but when he tried to walk away, 3 panels slid shut to trap him inside. When he touched one, it was hot enough to melt the fingertips of his gloves. The craft then turned counterclockwise to reveal a new panel. This one had a grid of holes that blasted Michalek in the chest with heated gas and threw him backwards, out of the craft. His clothes were on fire, and he tore the burning items from his body as the strange craft flew away. The experience left him nauseous and he vomited multiple times as he fled the area. Some sources say he also saw pink dots in his vision. This all left him too disoriented to find his way, so knowing the road was to the southeast, he then tried using his compass, but the needle went haywire. Thankfully, he did eventually locate the road, but he wasn't home free quite yet. Constable G.A. Soltke, a police officer, happened to notice the frazzled man and believed him to be drunk, but there was no smell of alcohol. So the officer claimed he wanted to help Steven get to Falcon Beach for medical treatment, but said his offer was declined. Yet Steven said the officer was dismissive and refused to help. To be fair, I can see how one might be dismissive of someone claiming to have been inside of a UFO, but this was still a disturbed man who was clearly alone and in need of help. They were essentially in the middle of nowhere. Michalek did eventually make his way back to the motel where he spoke to the owner about seeing a doctor, but the only doctor was unavailable at the time. That sounds like some Andy Griffith stuff right there, but I guess it is the 1960s, so we'll let it slide this time. With no other options available, Steven returned to his room where he called his wife. He said there he had had an accident and that he was returning home on a Greyhound the following day. His son later picked him up from the bus station and drove him directly to Misericordia Health Center, where he was admitted to the emergency room. The burns on his chest and stomach matched the pattern he described as being on the exhaust panel, and though he was soon released from the hospital, he continued to suffer from nausea, diarrhea, headaches, blackouts, weight loss, and, well, some sources even say he also emitted a sulfuric smell. I like to think most of us wouldn't have gone into the mystery aircraft in the first place, but I guess if you had, what the hell would you do next? Upon his release, Michalek sold his story to the Winnipeg Tribune, which published his experience under the heading, "I was burned by a UFO." And later that same year, he published his own manuscript with Oz Nova Publications titled, "My Encounter with the UFO." Sadly, Steven's ongoing symptoms eventually forced him to seek treatment at the Mayo Clinic. There, they determined he was sound of mind and concluded his physical condition was consistent with radiation poisoning, but his test results came back negative. Altogether, he lost 13 pounds, and his lymphocyte count dropped to almost lethal levels. He was once quoted as saying that the burns returned in the same pattern every 3 months until the day he died in 1999. Never once did he doubt his encounter was something otherworldly, and he passed that belief on to his youngest son. Stan was only 10 years old at the time, but he eventually appeared in an episode of Unsolved Mysteries to discuss the events from his perspective. Now let's rewind just enough to discuss how authorities handled Steven's claims. As we know, his supposed incident happened on May 20th, 1967, and every article tells the story just a little bit differently. It's normal to have minor discrepancies in the finer details, But this one is worse than usual. Thankfully, we can rely on the lovely 6-page police report that someone was kind enough to upload. It's dated June 26th, 1967, and it was written by Sergeant Davis. It's not written in chronological order, but we're going to discuss it in chronological order to the best of our abilities because we are not savages. On May 26th, Constable Schmalz advised that he spoke to the motel's cafe and beverage manager. According to this unnamed witness, McCalloch stayed in room 17 on May 19th, and between the hours of 8 and 9:30 p.m., he drank 3 bottles of beer in the motel's beverage room. I guess that's what they called motel bars back in the 1960s. Stephen was said to have left the motel at approximately 9:30, and he returned an hour later, sometime around 11, at which point he drank 2 more beers. The manager said he was not too terribly drunk, or maybe not even drunk at all when he left, nor did he purchase alcohol to take back to his room. In Stephen's interview, he claimed to have left the motel at roughly 6 a.m. on the morning of May 20th, and his timeline was corroborated by the maid who cleaned his empty room at 7:30 that same morning. Mrs. Bweck, the motel owner, told police she saw Stephen between 3 and 4 p.m. on the 21st. This is when he approached her, stating that he was in need of a doctor. Since there was apparently no doctor available, she referred him to the police. McCalloch left and later returned asking to make a collect call to Winnipeg, at which he was directed to a phone booth outside. Nearly everyone he spoke to that day said he behaved as if he were intoxicated, but not a single one could say they smelled the booze on him. On May 27th, Davis questioned Stephen about his alcohol consumption, and he denied having anything to drink on the night in question. There was also a discrepancy in the cafe manager's timeline. He claimed to have seen McCalloch at 8 p.m., but that simply wasn't possible. Stephen traveled to Falcon Lake by bus, and he didn't even begin his 2-hour journey until 7:15. At the earliest, he would have arrived at around 9:15 to 9:30 that night. In Stephen's version of events, he was in his room until after 11 p.m. when he went to the beverage room for a burger and coffee. Later, Davis arranged for the manager to see McCalloch in person, and he confirmed it was the same man he served beer to on May 19th. The beverage room was busy that night, so the manager admitted he could have been mistaken about the time, but he was adamant that Stephen drank the beer. McCalloch was later confronted with the manager's accusation, but he continued to insist that he didn't drink. Davis states that he and squadron leader Biskey were in daily contact with Stephen during the period of May 26th to May 30th. Each day they hoped that he would feel well enough to come up and search for the supposed landing site. On May 30th, the 2 men drove to Stephen's home in Winnipeg, where he drew them a map of the landing site. Biskey was then able to coordinate with the Canadian Army to obtain the use of a Hillier helicopter for the following morning. They argued this to be the best course of action due to the possibility of vegetation growth concealing the site. This risk grew more likely with each passing day, and investigators were desperate to win the race against Mother Nature. On the morning of May 31st, David and Constable Anderson drove to Falcon Lake, where they met with Biskey and other Canadian Air Force personnel. At noon, another Army helicopter joined the search, but even with Stephen's map, the search efforts were pretty much fruitless. His instructions were to look for a flat piece of rock 300 feet long and 100 feet wide, which should have been doable. Rocks that large are very rare at Falcon Lake, but once again the search was called off as night drew near. Ultimately, it was decided all efforts to locate the supposed landing site should be futile without Stephen there to point them in the right direction. Davis and Anderson drove the 2 hours back to Winnipeg that very evening, and this time Stephen felt well enough to join them. The 3 men left for Falcon Lake early on the morning of June 1st. In an earlier interview, McCalloch recalled walking a little over 3,000 paces to reach the highway after he saw the craft. This was estimated to mean that he couldn't have traveled more than 2.5 to 3 miles before reaching the road. So, The air search covered about a 4 to 5 mile area. Shortly after their arrival, Stephen was taken up in a helicopter, but he wasn't able to recognize any landmarks from the air. Everything looked too different. That afternoon, they changed tactics. Davis and Anderson escorted Stephen to the area where his shopping bags and saw were previously located, and they managed to cover between 3 and 4 miles before nightfall. Yet they still found nothing of significance. This was actually the first and only mention I saw of the gloves and saw, so now that you know what I know, we can move on to the next section. Davis felt that McCalloch was wandering around aimlessly without any real sense of where he was going. When questioned about this, he claimed he had been following quartz veins in the rock facings while prospecting and wasn't paying attention to his surroundings. Despite these initial difficulties, Stephen insisted he would find the site, and he appeared disgusted with himself for not having already found it. The search came to an end in the early evening, and McCalloch was home by 10 that night. Davis and Anderson returned to Falcon Lake that following morning and resumed their search with assistance from Air Force personnel. This time they expanded the radius even further, but they still came up empty-handed. The effort was officially called off that afternoon on June 2nd at 2 p.m. On Saturday, June 3rd, the head of the United States UFO project at the University of Colorado, Dr. Roy Craig, came to conduct his own investigation of the possible UFO sighting. He spent the first day interviewing Stephen, and Sunday was spent exploring Falcon Lake. The doctor was initially impressed with McCalloch during the interview, but when they actually got to the lake, he began having doubts. As he did when searching with the police, Stephen was stumbling around without any real sense of as to where he was going. On June 6th, Dr. Craig contacted Davis with a request for additional information he might have, and the men did meet, but it didn't seem Craig learned anything new with his troubles. On June 8th, Squadron Leader Biskey and other Air Force personnel flew to Falcon Lake to examine a microwave tower after it was speculated that McCalloch might have climbed it for an eagle-eye view of the terrain. If he did, some thought it was possible he might have been burned by the electricity at the top, but Biskey concluded that this would have been highly unlikely. The tower was approximately 1 mile north and east of Falcon Motel, and in that same vicinity he found a spot that looked very much like the sketch Stephen gave the police. They thoroughly searched the area but found no evidence whatsoever. They informed McCalloch of this location, but at the time of the report, Stephen had not been able to look at the site himself. I saw no further mention of this area, so it's likely he either didn't go or he couldn't find it very familiar. With this, the Air Force considered the matter closed pending the discovery of new evidence. The only thing they had that could technically be counted as evidence besides the shopping bags and saw was Stephen's burned welding gloves. He welcomed the police to perform any test they'd like, and it was in turn passed along to Biskey. That about does it for the actual investigation portion of the report, though. But the last page and a half are arguably the most interesting of all. I want to read this paragraph to you. I cleaned up some of the repetitive parts to save time, but I encourage you all to read it for yourselves at a later date. In light of the increasing prevalence of UFO sightings, and because there's the distinct possibility that our personnel will be the first ones approached by the observer, I have obtained a copy of the Air Force's instructions on how to deal with UFO reports. It covers what information should be obtained from the observer and how the report should be channeled. It's not surprising to hear that there was an increase in sightings after Stephen's story gained international notoriety. Such is the way, but hearing it in such an official capacity adds a healthy dollop of realness to it all, don't you think? The instructions were brief enough to include in the report, which means I can read them to you right now. Now, this is the official two-step process according to Canadian Air Force bases and other forces at the time. The first section says, reports of UFOs are frequently received at Canadian Force bases from various sources. Canadian Forces Headquarters is responsible for processing any action required regarding the report. The report should be transmitted to headquarters in accordance with Section 2. Section 2 says, unclassified priority messages should be addressed to CanForce HED, and the first words in the text should be for CFOC UFO report. All reports should include as much of the following information as possible. A. Date and time of sighting. B. Sky conditions. C. Observer's identity. D. Observer's location. E. Identification of any other witnesses. F. Description of the object. G. Duration of the sighting. And H. Any other relevant information. This form was published by the Royal Canadian Air Force on October 7th, 1966. And that, my friends, is how the Canadians handled UFO sightings in the 60s. The Central Forces headquarters would assess these reports to determine whether or not further investigation was required, and if it was, they would pass the information along to the closest Air Force unit to make the necessary inquiries. Now, there are a few inconsistencies that I wanted to mention before we conclude the story of Stephen McCalloch. You'll notice the police report stated the supposed landing site was never found, but most articles are actually saying otherwise. Some say a perfect circle of burned vegetation was found when Stephen returned to Falcon Lake with the police, while others say he found it with a friend while exploring on their own weeks after the fact. Some say the circle was 15 feet in diameter, while others say it was actually 30 feet wide. As far as I can tell, this is just how urban legends begin, but who knows? Maybe there was a crop circle, but the government decided to cover it up. That's not the only supposed evidence found that was never mentioned in the official report. Some articles also mentioned pieces of melted radioactive metal were found along with high levels of radioactive elements in the soil and Stephen's clothing, but this was ultimately concluded to be the result of radium veins that happened to be nearby. Or is that what they want us to think? Most articles did agree that initial theories concluded our man was merely hallucinating due to alcohol consumption, but most of the official investigations ended with inconclusive results. No one could definitively say or explain how McCalloch's physical wounds and symptoms occurred. Skeptics tend to conclude Stephen's injuries did indeed result from some sort of drunken stupor, but I failed to find any explanations as to how. And I, for the life of me, can't seem to come up with my own theories of how he could have done this. As to why he might do such a thing, I don't really know. It would not only conceal the true cause of his injuries, assuming that's something he'd want to hide, he could possibly dissuade competing prospectors from staking their own claims on veins in the area. Of course, this would have the opposite effect as hordes of investigators, reporters, and members of the public flocked to the scene. There were a few attempts to explain Stephen's health conditions with an allergic reaction, but I can't get behind that one honestly. The science seems a bit, iffy. I find it difficult to believe allergies are the answer. Even if the initial wounds were so easily explained, I've never heard of an allergic reaction resulting in years of serious health concerns Stephen ultimately experienced. Have you? Now, I did try to check around for some other similar sightings that were supposedly occurring at the time, but I only really found 2 other ones. Back then, it was fairly common for locals to still visit the garbage dump just to watch bears rummage for food, apparently. One night, a server from the hotel went there with her boyfriend, and on the drive home, a silver object appeared in the sky. It followed them for some time, but her boyfriend was able to speed up, and they made it safely into town. The server was living in the hotel's staff accommodations, and this experience rattled her so badly that she refused to leave her room for the following day. Sometime later, the hotel's owner's son, Steve Busek, received a strange call from a friend's brother. Bob and Bill said they could hear an electronic sound coming from the woods near the home of Penguin Resort. Steve walked down by the road to check it out, and when he came to the final hill, he heard it clear as day, a steady beeping sound. It almost sounded like it had some sort of pulsating influence to it, like it was coming from the trees. The three young men ventured into the woods with their flashlights, but the source seemed to be coming from everywhere all at once. The next day, Steve spoke with a local trapper who was somewhat of an expert on the unusual. When Steve told him about the electronic beeping, he laughed and said it was probably only a saw-whet owl. All I can say is that it must be one strange owl sound if it was some sort of electronic pulsating sound. Or could this have been related to the Stephen McCallick experience? I don't know, and we'll probably never know for sure. So, ultimately, Swamp Folk, what do you guys think? Is there a theory you agree with, or do you have your own? Have any of you ever visited Falcon Lake yourself? I would love to hear about any personal experiences you may have, and be sure to let me know if you want to learn more about UFO sightings. It's interesting to note that Falcon Lake isn't terribly far from Washington's border, which does happen to be one of the highest number of UFO sightings in our country. Coincidence or something more? I don't know. We'll discuss that in another video. It was really fun to cover one of these. I haven't done one of these in a couple of years. I think the last one I did was a case where a bunch of Illinois police officers were allegedly chasing down a UFO. And then the one I did before that was the strange and infamous case of the Warminster thing. You can find both of those on my channel. I'm definitely looking to cover more stuff like this, so definitely put your suggestions down below. An Experience I Won't Forget by Caleb. I recently found your show and have really enjoyed the chilling stories you share. However, I have made a point to stick to more of your cryptid and camping stories, as my wife and I only do ghost stories after one gets a little too real. I don't understand what happened, but getting other opinions might help us make more sense of it. My wife and I dated for 2 years over a long distance while I was out of state for school, and when I finished, we finally decided it would be best to have a face-to-face relationship. I moved her into my hometown, and starting from scratch with nothing, we moved into my sister's old room. Her family and I are all devout Christians, and her father was a Bible professor at a local university, so I never thought something like what occurred would happen. My girlfriend, now wife, had told me that her family had a few run-ins with paranormal occurrences over the years, and I knew that her father had pagan and Christian relics in his office. Still, I never thought much about it, as I had never experienced anything abnormal. That changed when one evening in the fall, we talked after dinner and told each other ghost stories we had heard over the years. Again, I never experienced anything paranormal and never thought I would, but I found the stories chilling and exciting. I don't know if we talked about this subject too long that night or what happened, but I think I said something along the lines of, I almost wish I'd experienced a haunting. For whatever reason, but we should have taken these stories more seriously than we did. We all went to bed like usual that night, and my wife and her sister went to my wife's room, her parents went to their room, and the dogs in the living room. It left me alone in my sister's room. Her sister's room was unfamiliar to me and a little unnerving, as she had a lot of old dolls from her childhood on the shelf facing the bed. So I typically left the door open where all the hall lights could shine in. I could feel in the back of my mind that I was still half asleep, so I spent a few seconds trying to get my eyes to focus and my mind to start fully working. By the time I was completely conscious and out of my fog, the figure was no longer there. As if I had blinked and it was gone. Thoroughly spooked, I chalked it up to being half asleep and seeing things and tried to go back to sleep. Later that next day, my wife and I were going about our day, and I could tell that something was really off. She wasn't as upbeat and seemed more on edge than usual. Whenever I would ask about this, she would attribute it to something else that was going on entirely. On a hunch, I told her about what I had seen and experienced that past night, trying to make it out as a joke. She didn't laugh, but looked right at me and told me something had also happened to her. She told me that at one point during the night, she got cold and tried to pull her heavy comforter over her more fully, but it felt like it was stuck on something. She pulled and began calling out her sister's name, who was sleeping on the floor nearby. They turned on the lamp on the nightstand and saw that the corner had been tucked into one of the drawers of the nightstand. This would seem innocent enough, but the nightstand was a half a foot away from the bed and definitely wouldn't happen naturally. This has never happened before and never has it happened since. From the best my wife and I could figure out, what she experienced and what I had must have happened around the same time of night and correlated together somehow. I told her father the next day, and he and I went and examined the area of the hallway where I saw the figure. There was nothing noteworthy that we could find outside of this relic-filled office that was behind a door. I lived there for quite some time after this and didn't really experience anything else that I could really mention to you, nor did any of the family pets act abnormally. However, from then on, my wife and I stopped watching movies or telling stories about the paranormal. My hopes in writing into your show today, Mr. Swamp Dweller, is that somebody listening to this in the comments may have something similar they've experienced. Someone else may have some insight into what may have happened that night, although I'm not sure I want to know. This is the first time I've typed this story out or gone over it thoroughly, and I dearly hope this was a good decision. Haunted Apartment by Tal. Hello, Swamp Dweller. I just started watching your show last week and have been enjoying your videos. Here is one of my stories I would like to share. For some time, I lived in a third world country in South Asia while I was a missionary for the churches from 2017 to 2019. It was early on in my service, and I shared an apartment with 3 other missionaries. Our apartment was pretty beaten up and definitely old. About a month before I arrived, the woman who lived next door sadly committed suicide. When my roommates told me this, I didn't really overthink it. But over the first week living there, we all noticed a change in the overall vibe in our place. It seemed to be darker, colder. We were all pretty lighthearted and laid-back people, but the vibes were just off. One night, while laying in bed, we heard a strange noise. For context, our apartment had a spacious living room, a dining room, and a small kitchen in the front of the apartment. Turning left would lead you to the back, where you would find 2 rooms and 2 bathrooms. There was also a room that was connected to the kitchen. It was boiling and humid, and we only had 1 AC fan installed in the more enormous back bedroom. So we all moved our beds in there to sleep, each one of our beds against the room's 4 walls with the door in the corner. So we began to hear noises coming from outside our room. We would hear footsteps as well as the switches to the fans being turned on and off repeatedly. One night, we even heard our iron fall to the ground. When we ran out to see what happened, it wasn't right next to the ironing board, but it was on the kitchen floor as if someone had thrown it. We were pretty freaked out, but none of us were ever alone, seeing that this was a rule that we agreed and followed for our 2-year service that we never broke. We were always with our companion. Me being the youngest and the one with the least experience, I was pretty scared. Not to mention homesickness, I come from a middle-class family in a small town on the west side of the United States, so I was beginning to feel pretty depressed and have a sense of someone watching me. One of the other missionaries in my apartment was a native of this country and only had 2 months until he went home. We will call him D. He noticed my depression and took me under his wing. The other 2 people were from England and California, respectively. I was companions with the British missionary, who we will call B, and we will call the 4th J. So one night, as we were all sleeping, D had woke up from a cold breeze. He looked over at my bed and swore he saw a woman in a shawl hovering over my bed. He tried to yell and get up from his bed, but could not move or speak, almost like he was in some sort of paralysis. He was terrified. The woman sat there looking at me and stroking my face. She suddenly looked up at D, and he blacked out. The next day he told us what had happened. I believed him, and B and J did not. Fast forward 2 months of similar spooky things going down, and D eventually leaves and goes home. N from Utah arrives, and we become friends instantly. One day I told them about the woman next door, and he was skeptical about her ghost taunting us. But as time went by, with continued unexplainable things going down, we all felt kind of eerie. One evening, the property manager is in the apartment next door cleaning. We hear him talking and a woman's voice is replying. However, it was all said in one of the country's 20+ languages, which we did not speak. Suddenly he runs out of the apartment. We go up to the roof, as we were not allowed to explore the city that night, and watch him from above as he goes to a cemetery a block away and jumps over the gate. He begins digging things up and running around the cemetery like a madman, screaming. We had no idea what to do and eventually just went inside, occasionally hearing him and others yelling. This man then left, and we never, ever saw him again. I think he quit. A few weeks later, we were still hearing noises and footsteps, and then one day the dead woman's son came, packed up all her stuff, and left. As soon as he did, we all felt like lighter. It felt like everything just basically stopped. The strange occurrences were no more, and the apartment was all like brighter. It's hard to explain. I believe that woman's ghost was haunting the apartment and the building and the people and all that good stuff. I have many more stories from before my time in this country that would go well with your other featured content, but I'll send those in at another day. Always be aware and alert by Dame W. Hey everyone, I am 19 years old and I live in the very southeast area of Washington State near the Blue Mountain Range. The story took place in a valley I used to live in and live less than 45 minutes away from it to this very day. This story took place when I was around 12, and it's not the most intense story, but trust me, it still leaves me terrified to this day, and I swear I can still see this thing every once in a while at the corner of my eye. Anyways, I have been listening to Swamp Dweller's stories for quite some time when it made me feel the same dread as I did that day when coming across this thing. I had been walking home in a very well-lit and populated area where I live. I walked down the final street before turning onto my family's private road. As I was walking, I was crossing the street that came off Main Street to my house, but then I felt dread that I had never felt before wash over me. So I stopped in the middle of the dark, but it was lit by a streetlight when I started making a complete 360 of my surroundings. That's when my gaze came upon the dark side of the street that I was standing at the top of. At first I stood there scared and sweating bullets, looking for anything to explain how I felt, but there was nothing to attribute it to. So even through my dread and paranoia, I took about 10 steps toward the pure darkness. Just then every feeling became 10 times worse. I stopped and I was just waiting for anything to happen, anything to show itself. But eventually I saw something in the orchard next to me, just a bit ahead. It was on all fours. It was utterly dark, like it was made of shadows, standing about 3 to 4 feet. Then, as soon as I saw it, I felt like it looked towards me with no facial features. Just pure darkness. I was petrified. I can't even explain the feeling that it made me feel. It turned to the road, bolting so fast that it was unreal. When it ran to the road, I got a more detailed look at this thing. Being more scared than ever, nothing, even my terrible experience, made me feel as fearful as I was when I saw the figure so clearly. But as soon as it bolted across the street, it also disappeared instantly, like it was just a flash. Like it had just become a part of the light around us, like it was never there at all. I couldn't figure out what I saw that night, and I just started running to my house, never stopping, about a half mile all the way. I was out of breath, my lungs were on fire, my legs were aching, but I could not. I just could not look back behind me. I don't know what I saw that night, and even with all the stories I've listened to on the Swamp Dweller channel or anywhere online, I cannot find anything similar. If anybody listening to this story has any idea what I may have seen, please let me know in the comments. In 2009, I was interested in the paranormal, since I had many paranormal experiences growing up. I found a website that held ghost tours at the old Southwestern General Hospital. I was excited and ready to go on a ghost hunt. The group that held the ghost tour was named Ghost, or Ghost Hunters of South Texas. The group was professional, and they used many of the items that paranormal researchers used at the time. Before the tour, they showed us proof that they have captured in previous investigations while investigating the property. EVPs included a little boy saying, "Play with me, please," and a woman with a southern accent responding to questions. The woman is said to be in an old-time dress, and sometimes old-time nurse attire. After the tour, the group said they were having openings for new members, and the new members would be tested and would be considered in maybe being part of the new team. I was quick to join and try out. I made the team. The team would have private group ghost hunts, so we would have the building to ourselves. The third floor was used as a hospice type of area. The building has 4 floors. The first, second, and fourth floor were left abandoned, and they looked like a scene out of a horror movie. Hospital beds lay in rooms dusty and unused. Many had dates from 1995 and before. I even found a death log that had many names and dates. The most active areas were the 4th and 2nd floor. The 4th floor had a baby nursery, and many rooms that were once used for families that would be welcoming new babies. One EVP that was caught in that area was one of crying babies. At the time the EVP was caught, there were no babies in the building, and it was after midnight sometime when it was caught. Also on the 4th floor, there was a long hallway with empty patient rooms. In that hallway, shadows were always seen running or moving. The 2nd floor was an old area. Also, many shadow figures were seen in this area. When doing research on the deaths in the building, I came up with what looked like to be a nurse who was crushed to death when a malfunction with the elevator happened years ago. During the time I was a part of this group, we investigated this building tons of times. I might even care to say maybe over 100. I also led ghost tours in the building with other members. I witnessed shadows, disembodied voices, screams, and one time heard a female humming a song only to find the room empty and dark. I've seen videos of doors opening on their own with no wind or people in the building. Also, the 3rd floor had employees that would see things and hear things very often. Patients also complained of a kid running in their room or a man standing over their bed just looking at them, only to disappear. Over the years, I gained experience and loved what I did. As a group, we investigated many places such as schools, homes, and cemeteries in El Paso. We also got to investigate the old Esarco smelter before it was demolished several years later. I got to ghost hunt with people from Ghost Hunters and Ghost Hunters International. I met many celebrities and the group had them take their own personal ghost tours. It was fun and I grew a thick skin for fearing anything that goes bump in the dark. One of my favorite places to investigate was Southwestern General Hospital. I never believed in being followed home. One night after investigating, I was at my apartment eating on my couch and watching TV. I had my hallway light on near the front door that was visible from where I was sitting. Suddenly, from the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow of a person on the wall near the door. I turned and saw the shadow in full form. It was about 6 foot tall and completely black. Then, not even a second later, the shadow moved as if it was running down my hallway to my bedroom. I froze in horror, thinking somebody was in my apartment. I got up and walked to my bedroom. Nobody was there. I searched the whole house up and down, and then I thought to myself, maybe I'm just going crazy. I soon went to bed a few minutes later. It was probably about 3:20 a.m. when I felt my bed shaking. I woke up to my sheets being pulled off me very slowly and deliberately. I tried to move, but I just could not. My sheets slid very slowly off me towards the floor. I could not move, and I started to hear growling in my right ear. From the corner of my eye, I could see something moving near my head on the right of me. It was on my pillow. I could only see from the peripheral vision that it had hair. It was hairy and brown. If I could compare it to something, I would say Chewbacca from Star Wars type hair. It was moving, very slowly, but obviously very deliberately. It was growling as well. My eyes started to water up with tears. I tried to move my arm, but I just couldn't. I could only move my fingers. The blanket was still being pulled off me little by little until it hit the floor and I was no longer covered by my sheet. I felt the hairy thing moving right next to me, and the growling grew louder. Then suddenly, I was able to sit up and I turned and looked to see what was there next to me. The hairy thing was gone, but I could see the imprint of where it had sat, right next to me just a moment ago. It was the size of a full-grown cat. Then I looked around the room to gather my sanity. I don't own a cat. My sheet was on the floor, and my eyes were still watery. I asked myself, maybe it was just sleep paralysis. I found it hard to sleep that night, since I lived alone in that apartment. The next day I had a girl over to my apartment. I was seeing her from school. I was playing PlayStation and she asked if she could take a nap in my bed. I said of course. She went to my bed and fell asleep. Around 20 minutes later, she suddenly came back to my living room in tears. She said, I have to leave now." I asked her what was happening and what was wrong. What she said shocked me. She said that something shook the bed and woke her up. She could not move, and then something was growling and started getting close to her ear. Then the bed went down as if somebody lied down next to her. She tried to scream for me and could not. Then she felt as if somebody was breathing on her neck as the growling grew louder. She said it lasted about 2 minutes, and then she was finally able to move. Once she was able to move, she ran to me in the living room. After she explained this, I grabbed her stuff and helped her leave. I did not tell her what happened to me the night before, but I had that same exact experience, and what happened to her was enough proof that something was not right. I could not explain what was happening. First thing that came to mind, that something probably followed me home from the hospital. After a few days, all the activity suddenly stopped. Only when I would go in on investigations, I would see shadows in my apartment, and then they would just go away. I loved what I did, and the only time I feared the paranormal was this moment. I no longer ghost hunt, and the group no longer gets together. Southwest General Hospital was purchased and is now remodeled and is in use. I can only imagine what the employees of the LTAC go through by being in that building. Every now and then I drive down Cotton and pass the building. I miss the days of being part of Ghost El Paso. If you are ever in El Paso after stopping by at Chico's Tacos, be sure to pass by the old building by the Star on the Mountain, formerly known as Southwest General Hospital. To start this story, we need to jump back to 2013. My husband and I were separated, and I would often pull away from everyone in my life. All in all, I was extremely lonely and dealing with a lot. My therapist recommended meeting new people through meetup groups, so I gave it a shot. I joined a paranormal meetup group and attended my one and only ghost hunt. Overall, it was kind of silly, but the inn that hosted the event is historically beautiful. The place also has a tragic backstory of an unsolved murder of 2 teenage girls in the 1970s. I was traumatized at this point in my life, so a lot of the details are blurry. But basically, we split into small groups and explored the small property. We then conducted Ouija board sessions. I was surprised when we experienced activity. You are probably thinking that it was all a setup. I would have too, but the activity was directed at me. The first thing that happened was through the EVPs. A childhood nickname that I have not used in many decades was said. Then, another name was repeated multiple times through the EVP and through the Ouija board. And finally, my name was spelled when asked who they are talking to. The other name was common, and it meant nothing to me at the time. The next morning, I learned the suicide of one of my cousins. I'd grown up with this cousin, and we had been extremely close through childhood. Living on opposite sides of the country, though, we had not seen each other in such a long time. She had taken her life while I was on my hunt. The name that played on repeat was her father's. She had passed when we were children. I feel like my uncle was reaching out, using childhood nicknames to warn me of the death of my cousin. I have not shared my story before, but I do have this one interesting experience that I have not been able to come up with an explanation for ever since it happened. I like to think of myself as a cynic when it comes to the paranormal. I want to believe in it. However, I'm not religious and will not convince myself until I know for certain that there's no scientific explanation for the happenings, and this is the closest I can think I have ever gotten. My family decided we should go on an organized ghost hunt at the neighboring town. It was late at night and there were 3 sections to this. The first involved using a Ouija board type thing with a glass. Nothing happened on this one. The second involved trying to reach out to spirits in a dark room. Nothing happened in this one either. The experiences come from the third section, which was an incredibly old courtroom, and we used technology. Firstly, there were digital thermometers set up, and one of our family members was sat below one. These thermometers flashed when temperature spontaneously dropped from room temperature, supposedly a sign of ghost. Suddenly, this family member jumped up sort of spooked and moved seats while the organizers were explaining to us what we were going to do. He proclaimed he felt something very cold and tingly. Lo and behold, the thermometer was also flashing and showing exceptionally low temperatures right by where he was sat. That was odd enough, but the second experience was just as odd. I was in a room by myself with my uncle. I had an EMF meter that lit up in the presence of an electromagnetic field. I do not know how these devices work, but I do know that they do. However, I do not know how legitimate the specific one I was holding was. I have my own at home, and it does react to real electrical sources such as my PC and plug outlets, etc. The other device I was using was something called the Spirit Box, which was supposed to detect words ghosts were saying and read them out. This device did not convince me at all, and I'm still not fully convinced by it, but it certainly was curious. I also was asking questions, and the EMF meter was flashing in accordance with these questions. It seemed to work, but there was no telling whether it was legitimate or not. However, I wanted to push the boundaries of yes and no questions, to see how realistic it actually was. If a ghost was real, surely it can answer any binary question if I gave it 2 options, and the corresponding number of flashes on the EMF meter for the answers, not just a yes or no. So I did. I asked aloud, "Are you a man or a woman?" Flash 1 for man, flash twice for woman. At the time, I was not convinced this would work as I was skeptical. However, the EMF meter flashed twice. And then, within 5 seconds of that, the spirit box displayed and read out the word female. 2 completely independent devices simultaneously confirmed the answer I supposedly got. That was a big deal for me, and still is to this day. I cannot figure out an explanation for that, and the 2 devices remained consistent for the entire session. I truly hope for the existence of something beyond life, and I hope this was my first glimpse at some actual proof for myself. I would like to start by saying that while I am interested in the paranormal, I tend to be skeptical and prefer to think things out rationally before dismissing every little thing as a ghost or the like. This experience, however, has no logical explanation I can think of. I am new here, and as well, I apologize in advance if I'm not doing this correctly. So, let's get into this. I was 17 and it was mid-October, nearing Halloween. My family had gone to a small, rural town to meet up with some good friends. We were going to get dinner and catch up for old time's sake, as my siblings and I had grown up with the children of the other families. After dinner, the parents stayed at the bar drinking, and those of us who were not of legal drinking age were starting to get a little bored. That is when one of my friends brought up the local cemetery. Apparently there is a cemetery in this town that is said to be haunted. I'm pretty positive that some ghost hunter paranormal type show did an episode about it or something, but the legends are said to have been around since before that. The story goes that a group of teenage boys were wandering into the graveyard one Halloween night with the intention of causing trouble and maybe stirring up some spooky ghost action in celebration of Halloween. After messing around for a while with no unexplained phenomena, they decided to sit in on top of the mausoleum, which is basically just a big tomb built up around a coffin instead of burying it in the ground. They were about to call it quits and head home when suddenly, unseen hands seemed to push one of the boys off the top of the tomb and into the ground. All the boys were obviously scared and hightailed it out of there, all of them feeling an eerie, ominous energy following them around for weeks after the incident. There have also been numerous reports of orbs, headstones inexplicably moving or disappearing altogether, ghostly apparitions, inscriptions being changed, flashes of light, strange noises, the whole works. I, of course, was more than excited to check it out. We arrived at the cemetery well after dark, and one of my girlfriends, we will call her Emma, and I were the only 2 brave ones enough to go in. We hopped right out of the car, careful to be as inconspicuous as we could since we did not want the police showing up and ruining our ghost hunting experience. We headed toward the entrance. It was chilly and a bit windy, as autumn in Wisconsin tends to be. We gripped each other's hands and started down the gravel path. As soon as we passed the fence that surrounded the plot of land, everything seemed to get very still and very quiet. We could not even hear the wind anymore, which was strange as it had been breezy as we got out of the car. It was so silent that even whispering and our steps in the gravel seemed, pun absolutely not intended, loud enough to wake the dead. Though there were no lights in or near the cemetery, there was enough moonlight filtering through the clouds to allow us to see well. We soon realized we had no idea where the fabled haunted mausoleum was, but kept walking anyway. We made a random left turn, and lo and behold, there it was, about 30 yards or so in front of us. Surprisingly, we had great luck, right? I don't think so. As we approached, I began to feel almost an electric sort of energy in my fingers and hands, but I wrote this off as just nerves or something due to breaking the law. We reached the tomb, and this thing is absolutely huge. It was easily twice my height, at the very least, and made of weathered gray stone with moss and lichen growing sparsely on it. We stare at it for a moment, and Emma whispers, "You should touch it." Being the big bad ghost hunter I am, I oblige. There is really nothing remarkable about the cool roughness of the stone, so I decide to take it a step further and hop up to sit up on the lip of the curved top of the thing. Again, nothing happens, so I jokingly whisper-shout, "If there's anyone here, any spirits or anything, come on out." After listening in silence for a second or two, I think, F it, and make my way to the very top where the kid is rumored to have been pushed off by ghostly hands. I have Emma snap a photo or two of me before climbing back down. Slightly disappointed by the lack of spooky encounters, we agree to head out and are about to do just that, when we see a pair of headlights slowly creeping down the road that borders one side of the graveyard. We immediately assume someone noticed us and called the cops, so we crouch down behind some bushes with the mausoleum directly to our left. Both of us are completely silent except for our breathing as we watch the vehicle slowly make its way down the street. I am watching its tail lights turn the corner when I hear a low, creepy, menacing laugh coming from right behind me. It sounded so strange, like it was a few feet away but also right in my ear at the same time. I'm freaked out, and I'm about to chalk it up to adrenaline-induced hallucination, when Emma, who is standing to my left, whispers, "Hey, did you hear that?" My blood ran cold, as I slowly nod a silent, "Yes, I did." I cautiously turn my head to one direction, and try to see if I can hear it. I kid you not. I didn't hear anything, but what I did see was a dark figure stand up from behind one of the headstones not 10 feet away from us. I scream bloody murder, and somehow end up on the ground as the next thing I know Emma is pulling at my arm shouting, "We have to run! We need to get out of here, come on!" I let her pull me to my feet and lead me blindly by the hand. We are full out sprinting, tripping over gravestones and plants and who knows what else in the dark. We cannot even find the exit in our panic. We finally reach a gap in the fence and I can feel the tears streaming down my face as I run for my life down the middle of the road, not even paying attention to the oncoming headlights until I nearly run into them. Luckily, it was the car containing the rest of our friends, and we rip the door open and throw ourselves inside screaming, "Go, go, please just drive," before we even bothered to sit in an actual seat or shut the door. I cannot for the life of me remember who was driving, but I think our panic and terror shook them enough that they did exactly what we asked of them and sped away back to the bar. They kept asking us what happened and if we were okay, but we would not calm down enough to answer them until we were back inside the bar and sat down. Still shaking and out of breath, we recounted our story to all of them, drunk parents included. I think a lot of them were skeptical, and honestly, I would have been too if I had not experienced it myself. In the weeks that followed, I felt the same eerie energy the boys in the legend describe hanging over my head. Personally, I attribute it more to paranoia after being scared out of my mind by something I could not actually see, but it made me feel uneasy nonetheless. It has been a few years since this happened, and I still cannot think of a single, logical explanation for what actually happened that night. While I have no idea how credible anyone else's reported experiences on this show are, I know we were without a doubt the only people in that graveyard, or even on the streets for that matter, and we would have heard someone trying to sneak up on us. The sound of that laugh was so unnatural. I cannot get it out of my head, Even now, I have never been more scared than I was that night, and I now know what people mean when they talk about not being able to fully believe in the paranormal until you have experienced it firsthand. Anyway, I just thought I would share this experience with you. I hope you enjoyed it. I have been a paranormal investigator since 2005. I started this because I've always been fascinated by the paranormal, not because I've had many experiences that I can remember. So, I was a bit skeptical of most people claiming to have ghostly encounters, although I do have an incredibly open mind. When I first started out, I took some classes on learning what to do. At the end of the series of classes, our instructor, a man named Neil McNeil, took us to an amazing town called Port Gamble, Washington. The last day of the class, we got to investigate an abandoned mansion called the Walker Ames House. This house is beautiful, but it has not been lived in for decades. The town keeps it up as much as they can for special events, etc., but it is not up to code to have anyone live in it permanently. Neil told us the history of the house and the ghost stories. In my mind, I was thinking this was just going to be a fun night exploring an old historic lumber mill home. I did not think that it would change my life forever. As I said, at the time I am a full skeptic. My mind cannot easily be changed or fooled by people. I must see things for myself. There were 6 of us in the house that night. Neil split us up into 2 groups. One group went down to the basement and we stayed on the 2nd floor. He had just warned us to stay out of this little hallway by the attic door. It was between the bathroom and the landing, because he was feeling a strong presence there of something evil. In my mind I thought, sure you did, sarcastically, and walked to a far bedroom. I heard him in another room answering questions of another investigator, but when I came out, I saw his shadow in the hallway, the little hallway he told us not to stand in. As I started to walk over there to see what he was doing, the shadow quickly came toward me and disappeared. I stood there staring for just a second and was kind of stunned. I still heard Neil and the other person talking, but the shadow was gone. I could not process it. I went around the corner and saw them talking in the little room right around the corner of the bathroom. I interrupted them. Who was just standing in the hallway? I said it way too loudly. Neil looked at me for a second and then said, June, no one was standing in the hallway. I replied, no, someone was standing in the hallway. I saw their shadow and it's gone now. He looked at me and smiled and asked what the shadow looked like. I saw a dark black shadow. It looked a little short, thick in the middle and bald with a round head. It was still light outside, but the sun was setting and all the shadows were elongated. This one was standing straight up and down. I even went downstairs outside and found a leaf and tore it down and made it into the shape of a person, to put it up to the stained glass window just in case it was natural. And nope, it wasn't. I was at a loss for words. When finally I could not come up with an explanation for it, Neil told me, unbeknownst to me, several people had seen shadows of people upstairs and several people reported seeing a shadow of a short, fat, bald man. I was not the only one. At that moment, while he was telling me this, we heard a yelp from the stairway. Another person coming up the stairway said she swore that she just saw the shadow of a person running across the landing and it disappeared. After that night, I realized I was hooked forever, being a ghost hunter.
The first photo showed nothing but trees. The second captured a blur of movement at the edge of the frame. But it was the third image that made my blood run cold. There, emerging from the shadows between 2 ancient pines, was a figure, humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, its proportions distorted in a way that defied natural law. And it was looking directly at the camera, at me. I lowered the viewfinder with shaking hands, my eyes darting to the deepening shadows around my campsite. Night was falling, and I was no longer alone in these woods. My name is Maggie Chen, and I've been a nature photographer for the better part of a decade. I've trekked through rainforests, scaled mountains, and waded through swamps to get the perfect shot. But nothing in all my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of the Olympic National Forest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a 2-week solo expedition to capture the raw beauty of the old-growth forest for a conservation magazine. I'd done dozens of trips like this before, and I was looking forward to the solitude, to immersing myself in nature without the distractions of the modern world. The first few days were idyllic. The forest was a photographer's dream, all towering evergreens draped in moss, hidden waterfalls, and dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. I set up my base camp in a small clearing near a babbling stream, venturing out each day to explore and photograph. It was on the 4th night that things started to get strange. I was reviewing the day's shots on my camera when I noticed something odd in the background of one image. A shape, just barely visible in the shadows between 2 trees. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light or maybe a deer, but something about it nagged at me. The next day, I returned to the same spot, determined to figure out what I'd captured. I set up my camera trap, a motion-activated camera designed to capture wildlife, and left it there for the day while I explored other areas. When I returned that evening and checked the camera, my heart nearly stopped. There were dozens of images, taken in rapid succession. The first few showed nothing unusual, just the forest floor and a squirrel or two. But then, the figure appeared, tall and impossibly thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. Its skin, where visible, was pale and almost translucent, stretched tight over an inhuman frame. And its face, God, its face, smooth and featureless, save for 2 large, dark eyes that reflected the camera's flash like a cat's. I stared at the images, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hoax, a trick played by some other hiker with too much time on their hands and a talent for Photoshop. But as I flipped through the sequence of photos, a chill ran down my spine. The figure was moving closer to the camera with each shot. In the final image, it was reaching towards the lens, long fingers blurred with motion. I packed up my gear with shaking hands and practically ran back to my campsite. That night, I barely slept. Starting at every snapping twig and rustle of leaves, I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there had to be a logical explanation, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. The next morning, I woke to find my campsite in disarray. My backpack had been emptied, its contents strewn about. My food cache, hung high in a tree to protect it from bears, had been torn down, the rope snapped as if it were thread, and there, pressed into a patch of soft earth near my tent, was a footprint, long and narrow, with toes that looked more like claws. My camera was lying next to it. With trembling fingers, I turned it on and checked the most recent images. My heart nearly stopped. There were new photos, taken while I slept. Photos of my tent, of me sleeping inside, visible through the mesh window. And in each one, that figure was there, getting closer and closer. I should have left then, packed up and hiked out, assignment be damned, but some combination of curiosity, stubbornness, and plain old stupidity made me stay. I convinced myself that if I could just get clearer photos, just understand what this thing was, it would all make sense. So I stayed, and each night, the creature came closer. I set up more camera traps around my campsite, capturing image after image of the being as it circled my tent. I barely slept, spending my nights huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my hunting knife and jumping at every sound. During the day, I'd venture out, following trails of broken branches and those strange footprints. I found places where the undergrowth had been crushed, as if something large had bedded down. Once, I found a tuft of hair caught on a branch, coarse and gray, like no animal fur I'd ever seen. As the days passed, I began to feel like I was losing my mind. The forest, once beautiful and inviting, now seemed menacing. The trees loomed over me, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in broad daylight. And still, I stayed. The need to understand, to document what I was seeing, had become an obsession. It all came to a head on what should have been my last night in the forest. I was planning to hike out in the morning, my assignment completed and my sanity hanging by a thread. I'd set up my cameras for one final night of observation, hoping against hope for that one clear shot that would prove I wasn't crazy. I must have dozed off despite my fear, because I woke suddenly in the pitch black of my tent. Something had changed. The ever-present sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of insects, had gone silent. And there was something outside my tent. I could hear it moving, softly but unmistakably, circling, sniffing. I lay there, paralyzed with terror, as it completed its circuit. Then, to my horror, I saw the zipper of my tent begin to move. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the opening of my tent widened. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch, eyes wide in the darkness, as a long, pale hand with too many joints slipped through the opening. The hand paused, as if sensing my fear. Then, deliberately, it reached toward my camera, which lay next to my sleeping bag. In that moment, survival instinct finally overcame my paralysis. I lunged for the camera, snatching it away from that terrible hand. In the same motion, I kicked out at the tent wall, tearing through the fabric and tumbling out into the night. I ran, blindly, desperately, clutching the camera to my chest. I crashed through underbrush, stumbled over roots, branches whipping at my face. Behind me, I could hear it pursuing. Not running, but moving with a terrible swiftness, flowing through the forest like smoke. I don't know how long I ran, or how far. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror drove me on. Finally, mercifully, I saw lights ahead. The ranger station at the trailhead, a beacon of civilization in the wilderness. I burst out of the tree line, gasping and sobbing. The startled ranger on duty took one look at my wild eyes and torn clothing and ushered me inside, locking the door behind us. The rest of that night is a blur. I remember telling my story, the ranger's skeptical looks turning to concern as he saw the raw fear in my eyes. I remember the police arriving, taking my statement. And I remember the moment when they asked to see my camera. With shaking hands, I turned it on and began to scroll through the images. But where there should have been dozens of photos of that otherworldly being, there was nothing. Just trees and shadows and normal forest scenes. Even the photos from that final night, the ones I was sure I'd taken of the hand reaching into my tent, were gone. In the harsh fluorescent light of the ranger station, surrounded by the trappings of civilization, my entire experience began to seem like a bad dream. Had I imagined it all? Had 2 weeks of solitude in the deep woods driven me to some kind of breakdown? But then I saw it. In the very last photo on the camera, barely visible in the background, was a figure, tall and thin, half hidden behind a tree. And though the image was blurry, I could swear it was smiling. I've never gone back to those woods. I've never told the full story to anyone but you. My editor got a watered-down version about being spooked by wildlife, and the photos I submitted were carefully curated to show nothing but the natural beauty of the forest. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I find myself thinking about what's out there in the deep woods, about the things that lurk just beyond the reach of our cameras and our understanding. And I wonder, with a chill that goes bone deep, if it's still out there, watching, waiting, for the next unsuspecting photographer to venture into its domain. So if you're ever in the wilderness, setting up your camera for that perfect shot of untouched nature, pay attention to the shadows between the trees. And if you see something moving there, something that doesn't quite fit, don't try to photograph it. Just run, and don't look back. because some things in this world are not meant to be captured on film. And once they notice you noticing them, they never forget. They never stop watching. And sooner or later, they come for you. The first time I saw her, I thought I was looking in a mirror. Same shoulder-length brown hair, same green eyes, even the same tiny scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident. But this was no reflection. It was a living, breathing woman who could have been my twin. Our eyes met across the crowded dining room, and I felt a chill run down my spine. As she smiled and waved, I knew with sickening certainty that my relaxing Caribbean cruise had just taken a turn into uncharted waters. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until that moment, I'd been enjoying a much-needed vacation aboard the Majestic Dream, a luxury cruise liner making its way through the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. I'm a 32-year-old software engineer from Seattle, and this was my first real vacation in years. I'd been looking forward to 10 days of sun, relaxation, and maybe a little romance if I was lucky. The first few days had been everything I'd hoped for. I'd lounged by the pool, indulged in far too many fruity cocktails, and even struck up a flirtation with a handsome guy named Mike, who was traveling with a group of friends. It was on the fourth night at the captain's dinner that everything changed. I'd dressed up for the occasion, wearing a new blue dress I'd bought specifically for the cruise. As I made my way into the grand dining room, I caught sight of myself in one of the large decorative mirrors and paused to adjust my hair. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just my reflection from a different angle. But as I turned to look directly at her, I realized with a jolt that she was a separate person, a person who looked exactly like me, down to the smallest detail. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the bustling dining room seemed to fade away. She smiled and waved, as if we were old friends. I felt rooted to the spot, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of elaborate prank or a very vivid hallucination. A waiter bumped into me, breaking the spell. By the time I looked back, she was gone, lost in the sea of passengers making their way to their tables. Throughout dinner, I couldn't focus on the conversation at my table. My eyes kept scanning the room, looking for my doppelganger. I saw her once, sitting at a table across the room. But when I blinked, she was gone again. "Sarah, are you okay?" Mike's voice brought me back to the present. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a laugh. "Sorry, just a bit tired, I guess." "Must be all that, son." But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Who was she? And why did she look exactly like me? The next morning, I was determined to find her and get some answers. I spent hours wandering the ship, checking every restaurant, lounge, and deck. But there was no sign of her. It wasn't until late afternoon that I saw her again. I was heading back to my cabin to get ready for dinner when I caught a glimpse of her turning a corner at the end of the hallway. I broke into a run, but when I rounded the corner, the corridor was empty. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, my face, smiling at me across the dining room. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and decided to take a walk to clear my head. The ship was eerily quiet as I made my way through the deserted corridors. I found myself on one of the upper decks, leaning against the railing and staring out at the moonlit ocean. That's when I heard it. Footsteps behind me, soft but distinct. I turned, half expecting to see my double. Instead, it was Mike, looking surprised to see me. "Sarah, what are you doing up so late?" I hesitated, then decided to take a chance. "Mike, this is going to sound crazy, but have you seen anyone on the ship who looks like me? I mean, exactly like me?" He frowned, looking confused. "What do you mean?" I told him everything, about seeing my doppelganger at dinner, about chasing her through the ship. As I spoke, I could see the concern growing in his eyes. "Sarah," he said gently when I finished, "I think maybe you should talk to the ship's doctor. Stress can do funny things to a person's mind, and I'm not crazy, I snapped, then immediately felt guilty at the hurt look on his face. I'm sorry, I know what I saw, Mike. She's real. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Okay, look, why don't we do some investigating tomorrow? If there really is someone who looks that much like you on the ship, other people must have noticed too, right? I agreed, grateful for his support, even if he thought I was losing my mind. We made plans to meet for breakfast, and I headed back to my cabin, feeling slightly better. That night, I dreamed of mirrors, endless corridors lined with mirrors, each one showing a slightly different version of myself. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fruitless searching. Mike and I questioned other passengers, checked passenger lists, even bribed a junior crew member to let us look at security camera footage. But there was no sign of my mysterious double. Other passengers were starting to give me strange looks. I'd overhear whispers as I passed, see people pointing and talking in low voices. More than once, someone approached me, insisting they'd just seen me in a completely different part of the ship. Mike stuck by me, but I could tell his patience was wearing thin. Maybe it was just someone who looked a lot like you, he suggested one afternoon as we sat by the pool. And now you're just seeing what you expect to see. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen, and I was becoming more and more convinced that something very strange was happening on this ship. It all came to a head on the 8th night of the cruise. I was walking back to my cabin after a late-night movie when I saw her again. She was standing at the end of the corridor watching me. This time, I was determined not to let her get away. I ran towards her, calling out, "Wait, who are you? Why do you look like me?" She turned and fled, and I chased her through the twisting corridors of the ship. Upstairs, down hallways, through lounges and restaurants. It was like a maze, and more than once I found myself in parts of the ship I'd never seen before. Finally, I cornered her in a dead-end hallway. She stood with her back to me, shoulders heaving as if she'd been running too. "Please," I gasped, out of breath. "Just tell me who you are." Slowly, she turned to face me, and as she did, I felt the world tilt sideways. Her face was mine, yes, but it was wrong somehow. The proportions were slightly off, the eyes a little too large, the smile a little too wide. As I watched in horror, her features seemed to ripple and shift, like a reflection in disturbed water. "Who am I?" she said, and her voice was a distorted version of my own. "I'm you, Sarah. Or rather, I'm who you could be, who you might become." She took a step towards me, and I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall. What are you?" Her smile widened impossibly. "I'm a possibility, a potential future. This ship, it exists in a place where realities intersect, where different versions of ourselves can meet." My mind reeled, trying to make sense of her words. But why? Why show yourself to me? She laughed, and the sound sent shivers down my spine. "To give you a choice, of course. You can go back to your life, your safe, predictable existence, or you can embrace the unknown, become something more." As she spoke, I noticed something behind her. The end of the hallway was shifting, shimmering like a heat haze, and beyond it, I caught glimpses of other places, other realities. She held out her hand. "Come with me, Sarah. See what you could become." For a moment, I was tempted. The promise of adventure, of the unknown, pulled at me. But then I thought of my life back home, of my friends and family, of Mike, probably worried sick about where I'd disappeared to. I shook my head. No, this is my reality, my life, and I choose it. Her face twisted in anger, becoming less and less human by the second. "You'll regret this," she hissed. And then, before I could react, she lunged at me. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact, but it never came. Instead, I felt a rush of wind, a sensation of falling, and then nothing. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my cabin. Sunlight was streaming through the porthole, and the sounds of passengers enjoying the morning filtered in from the hallway. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, but then I noticed something on my bedside table. A small silver pendant, shaped like a key. Something I'd never seen before, but that looked strangely familiar. I picked it up, and as I did, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. For just a second, I could have sworn my reflection smiled at me with a mouth that was a little too wide. The rest of the cruise passed uneventfully. I never saw my doppelganger again, and eventually, I managed to convince myself that stress and too much sun had played tricks on my mind. Mike and I grew closer, and by the time we docked, we were making plans to see each other back in the real world. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself looking at that silver key, and I wonder about roads not taken, about other versions of myself in other realities. And I can't help but think that somewhere out there, on a ship sailing through the spaces between worlds, another Sarah made a very different choice. So if you ever find yourself on a cruise and catch a glimpse of someone who looks just like you, remember my story. And think very carefully about the choices you make. Because sometimes, our doubles are more than just reflections. Sometimes, they're glimpses of who we might become, for better or for worse. The words were whispered with such urgency, such raw fear, that I felt my blood turn to ice. Whatever you do, don't be here at midnight. The weathered trucker who'd spoken them was already walking away, leaving me frozen in my seat, half-eaten burger growing cold on the plate in front of me. I glanced at my watch, 11:37 p.m. As I looked around the diner, taking in the tense faces and furtive glances of the other patrons, I realized with growing dread that I'd stumbled into something far more sinister than a late-night pit stop. My name's Jack, and until that moment, I'd been on a routine cross-country drive from New York to Los Angeles. I'm a freelance photographer, and I'd taken on a last-minute gig that required me to transport some sensitive equipment that couldn't be trusted to shipping companies. The pay was good, and I figured the road trip would give me a chance to capture some interesting shots along the way. I'd been driving for nearly 18 hours straight, fueled by gas station coffee and the kind of determination that only comes from a looming deadline. When I saw the neon sign for Mel's Diner, glowing like a beacon in the dark Nevada desert, I decided to pull over. My stomach was growling, and I figured a hot meal and a real cup of coffee would do me good. The diner looked like something straight out of a 1950s postcard. All chrome and red vinyl booths, with a jukebox in the corner playing old rock and era roll tunes. But as soon as I walked in, I sensed something was off. The place was surprisingly busy for the middle of the night, but the atmosphere was tense, almost electric. I slid into an empty booth and ordered a cheeseburger and coffee from a waitress whose smile seemed a little too forced. As I waited for my food, I couldn't help but notice how everyone in the diner seemed on edge. Conversations were hushed, and people kept glancing at the large clock above the counter. When my food arrived, I tried to strike up a conversation with the waitress. "Busy night, huh?" She nodded, her eyes darting to the clock. "Yeah, it usually is around this time." "Oh, you get a lot of late-night traffic?" She hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Look, honey, you seem nice. So let me give you some advice. Eat quick and get back on the road. You don't want to be here too long." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, hurrying off to another table. I sat there, burger halfway to my mouth, thoroughly confused. That's when the trucker at the counter turned to me and whispered those chilling words, "Whatever you do, don't be here at midnight." As he walked away, I noticed other patrons starting to leave. They moved with an urgency that seemed at odds with the late hour, practically running to their vehicles. I flagged down my waitress again. "What's going on? Why is everyone leaving?" She glanced nervously at the clock, 11:45 p.m. now, and sighed. "I shouldn't tell you this, but things happen here at midnight. Bad things. Nobody knows why, but it's been going on for years. Some say this place sits on some kind of convergence, a weak spot between worlds. All I know is, you don't want to be here when the clock strikes 12. I laughed, though it sounded hollow even to my own ears. Come on, you can't be serious. What? Is this place haunted or something? Her expression remained deadly serious. Worse, now please, for your own sake, finish up and go. I wanted to believe it was all an elaborate joke, some weird local custom to scare tourists. But the fear in her eyes, the palpable tension in the air, it felt too real to dismiss. I gulped down my coffee and threw some bills on the table, deciding that whatever was going on, I didn't want to stick around to find out. But as I stood up to leave, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The door to the diner was gone. Where the entrance had been was now just a solid wall, covered in the same tacky wallpaper as the rest of the place. I blinked hard, convinced I must be more tired than I thought. But when I opened my eyes, the wall was still there. "It's starting," someone whispered. I turned to see the other remaining patrons, about a dozen in total, huddled together in the center of the diner. The waitress was among them, her earlier composure crumbling as she clutched a coffee pot like a weapon. "What's starting? What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, panic rising in my throat. An old man with a face like weathered leather spoke up. "It's midnight, son, or it will be in about..." He checked his watch. 2 minutes. That's when they come." "Who comes? What are you talking about?" But before anyone could answer, the lights began to flicker. The jukebox, which had been quietly playing Great Balls of Fire, suddenly switched to a slow, discordant melody I didn't recognize. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop several degrees in a matter of seconds. "Circle up," the old man shouted. "Remember, don't look directly at them, and whatever you do, don't let them touch you." The group formed a tight circle, facing outward. Without thinking, I joined them, my back pressing against strangers as we huddled together. The waitress pressed something into my hand, a salt shaker. "Salt and iron," she muttered. "Only things that slow them down." I wanted to laugh, to tell them all this was insane. But the words died in my throat as I saw something moving outside the windows. Shapes, darker than the night itself, flowing like smoke but with a terrible purpose to their movement. They pressed against the glass, which began to frost over despite the desert heat. And then, as the clock struck midnight, the real horror began. The shapes outside seemed to coalesce, forming vaguely humanoid figures that were somehow more terrifying for their almost recognizable form. They oozed through the cracks around the windows, seeping into the diner like a noxious gas. Someone in our group whimpered. I felt a hand grasp mine and squeeze tight. The old man's voice rose in a chant, words in a language I didn't understand. Others joined in, their voices shaking but growing stronger as they repeated the phrases. The shadow figures circled us, their movements jerky and unnatural. I caught glimpses of limbs that were too long, of faces that shifted and changed like smoke. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and something rotten. One of the creatures reached out towards our group. Without thinking, I flung the contents of my salt shaker at it. The thing recoiled with a hiss that sounded like radio static, its form dissipating for a moment before reforming. Time seemed to stretch and distort. I couldn't tell if we'd been surrounded for minutes or hours. My arm ached from holding it out, salt shaker at the ready. My throat was raw from chanting words I didn't understand. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, when the press of bodies and the suffocating presence of the shadow creatures became too much, something changed. The old man's chanting reached a fever pitch, and suddenly, the air itself seemed to ripple. The shadow figures began to retreat, their forms becoming less distinct. They flowed back out through the windows, which shattered outward in a spray of glass. A wind whipped through the diner, carrying with it the last wisps of the creatures and the lingering smell of decay. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. We stood there in stunned silence for a long moment, The only sound our ragged breathing and the crunch of broken glass underfoot. Slowly, our circle broke apart. I saw tears on some faces, blank shock on others. The waitress was the first to speak. Everyone okay? Anyone touched? There was a general murmur of assent. No one, it seemed, had been injured, physically, at least. As if a spell had been broken, the diner burst into activity. People began sweeping up glass, righting overturned chairs, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy. I stood there, salt shaker still clutched in my hand, trying to process what I'd just experienced. The old man approached me, his eyes kind but weary. First time, huh? You did good, son. I found my voice at last. What were those things? Why here? Why at midnight? He shook his head. Wish I could tell you. Been coming here every night for 30 years, trying to figure it out. All I know is, they're getting stronger. And if we weren't here to hold them back. He trailed off, his implication clear. As the sun began to rise, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold, the door to the diner reappeared. People began to leave, nodding to each other with the camaraderie of soldiers who'd been through battle together. I made my way to my car on shaky legs, my mind still reeling. As I was about to drive away, the waitress ran out, pressing a piece of paper into my hand. If you're ever passing through again, she said, and you want to help, this is where we'll be. I looked down at the paper. It was a schedule, listing dates and times, a roster of guardians, keeping watch against the darkness. As I pulled back onto the highway, the events of the night began to feel like a dream. But the salt shaker on my passenger seat and the paper clutched in my hand were undeniable proof of what I'd experienced. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that diner. Part of me hopes I never see it again. But another part, a part I'm still coming to terms with, knows that I will. Because now that I've seen what's out there, now that I know what lurks in the spaces between moments, how can I not stand against it? So if you're ever driving through the Nevada desert late at night, and you see a diner glowing like a beacon in the darkness, think carefully before you stop. And if you do, keep an eye on the clock. Because when midnight comes, you might find yourself facing horrors beyond imagination, or standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, the last line of defense against the encroaching dark. And whatever you do, don't be there at midnight. Unless, of course, you choose to be.